just so you know, Carmen and I worked on this presentation together, but it has been my privilege and my pleasure to work on this project with other people. It's not my project, but it does mean a lot to me, and I think it's important to start off by saying that, of course, I work with Melanie, with Monica, who are both here. Carmen has been a big part of the project, particularly in terms of the Photovoice process, and Patience works with us as well. Anne-Marie Bothmaker is not here, but she's been involved in the project, and so has the Tusanani Foundation. So most of you would know by now that over the past 3 years or so, we've been working with young people who come from rural and township areas. They come from low-income households, and we've been tracking their progress and looking at what happens for them to get into university, what happens while they're there, and what's likely to happen once they come out of this process. We focus on students from low-income backgrounds because we think this throws into sharp relief who has wealth and power in our society, and also who has wealth and power in our higher education system. We also think that low-income students' struggles, but also their achievements, are things that point to some of what needs to change in higher education institutions and universities in particular for them to be more inclusive. So that's just to give you a background of the project and what we've been doing over the past couple of years. In this presentation, we critically reflect on the value of the Photovoice process or the Photovoice project, using the capability approach as a lens through which to understand or perceive this value. In our reflections, we draw on students' own written reflections on what they said they gained out of the Photovoice process, which happened towards the end of the project when we brought all of them together for the exhibition. So, just to give you a background about Photovoice, although those who will attend the workshop tomorrow will hear more about this and get a sense of the types of activities that students were involved in the process of getting to tell their stories through photographs. But Photovoice as a research instrument is based on 3 theoretical underpinnings. Firstly, the idea of education for critical consciousness, feminism and notions of voice, as well as participatory documentary photography. In the Photovoice process, participants are typically given cameras and asked to document different aspects of their lives and their experiences through photographs. And these images are then used to elicit analytical discussions amongst the participants and to give them an opportunity to narrate the personal significance of these images. Typically, at the end of the Photovoice process, there's an exhibition, and this is where stakeholders of the project and the knowledge that's created through the research are supposed to be there, engage with the findings, and see these images in order for them to be moved in a way, because the idea is that images allow us to add a layer of richness and thickness to data, which may not otherwise be achievable if you use interviews alone. So the idea is that the images are a potential way to elicit visceral responses from policymakers, and that people will feel moved to do something as a result of seeing these images. So again, the exhibition is supposed to be the space where policymakers are coming face to face with these photographs. So I'm just going to take you through some of the things that we did at our Photovoice project. So we worked in Gauteng, here in the Free State, and also in Limpopo with 19 students of the 65 that we've been interviewing year on year. And we had 4-day workshops that were more or less designed as follows. On the first day of the workshop, we talked about Photovoice so they could get an idea of what was expected from them. We had already established rapport because, of course, I'd been involved in interviewing them over time. So had Melanie, and Carmen was introduced to them at these workshops as somebody who'd be working with us to design the process. So we spoke about Photovoice. We had discussions about River of Life drawings and sort of giving them the opportunity to use art and drawings and images to begin this process of reflecting about their lives. And at the end of the first day of the workshop, we also had camera training where they learned basic principles of photography, how to take a decent photograph, focusing on things like composition, lines, angles, lighting, and so forth, so that they could get an idea of how to take a decent photograph. So at the end of the first day of the workshop, they went home with the cameras and they started practicing on taking these photographs. But this was before we had any discussions about what the photographs were actually going to be taken for. They knew at this point that they were learning how to take photographs in order to tell a particular story, but we hadn't started talking about what these stories were going to be. So on the second day of the workshop, this is where we started thinking a lot more about what we could tell stories about. And because in the project, in the broader Mirato project, we're interested in inclusive higher education learning outcomes, or what young people from low-income backgrounds are able to achieve as a result of being in higher education. So we thought it would be useful in these workshops to kind of focus on experiences of exclusion but also inclusion. And we had discussions about this so that we could sort of be on the same page about what these terms or what these concepts meant, and then also just having discussions about different ways in which inclusion or exclusion can look, how it may manifest itself in a higher education space. From there we went on to developing storyboards, which is, you know, trying to then figure out actually, so what story do I want to tell about inclusion and exclusion? Do I want to focus more on the exclusions? Would I like to focus more on the inclusions? What is the balance going to be like? What kind of images might I take to represent the thing that I'm trying to talk about in these images? And that's what a storyboard is. So they have a piece of paper on A4 and they kind of divide it into 6 pieces, and then they start to think about, you know, what's the beginning of my story going to be like? What are the events in the middle? What will the conclusion be? Just drawing from Holly's presentation this morning about the chronology, if you will, of stories and narratives. And then at the end of the day, that's when they went home with the cameras again to take some more photographs. So we thought it was important for them to have lots of time to practice taking the photos, because it's not it's a straightforward or simple thing to take a photograph, but thinking about how a particular image might convey a message or a meaning that you're trying to tell, and make sure that it captures a particular event or an experience in the best way possible isn't simple. So we said, you know, so now you've got your storyboard, you've got your river of life drawing, you've been thinking about how your life has been since you got into university, and we are focusing, not very strictly, but just to frame your stories in terms of what you've experienced in relation to exclusion and what you've experienced in relation to inclusion. So then they could go home and take these photographs with all of this in mind. And it's also important to note that after each of these processes, so after the river of life drawings, we'd then put the river of life drawings on the wall. All of us go around as a group, and each person takes us through the river of life activity. So there was a lot of working apart alone as they were sketching and drawing and doing all of this, but then also listening to each person's river of life drawing, or listen to each person's ideas on their storyboard, and having those reflections happen as a group. On the third day, the focus was on trying to make sure that everybody had captured enough images to tell their story, and then also to reflect on these photographs, to select them, and start captioning each of the photos in relation to the storyboard that they'd had, and to see that the story did have enough to kind of capture the core message or the moral or the lesson behind the story. And between the third and the fourth day, so these days up to day 1 to 3 were quite consecutive, but the fourth day happened several months after we had concluded the third day of the workshop, because we needed time to go and do the workshops at the other locations, and we had to develop the photographs on high quality paper and make arrangements for the exhibition. For the exhibition, we brought all the students together, so from Gauteng, from Limpopo, they came to the Free State. They got to see their photographs for the first time, you know, sort of on display the way that it would be at the exhibition. They also had plenty of time to talk about the photographs or the photo stories, to try and identify commonalities or what was similar, what were cross-cutting themes in all of the photo stories. And this was quite interesting, because many of them, I mean, they knew us because they'd been involved in the project over a couple of years, but they didn't know each other. It turns out they didn't know much about the higher education experiences of students from other universities, because of how geographically sort of separated all of these spaces are. So there was a lot of surprise from some of them to kind of realize that some of their images or some of what they were telling in their stories was similar, because they didn't expect that to happen, even though they're all more or less from low-income backgrounds, so similar backgrounds, you know, according to our interpretation. So this process of looking at each other's photographs, looking for cross-cutting themes, identifying what was common, what was different, what was striking from them about these photographs was a process of collective data analysis, if you will. And what they did when we were talking about the common book that Monica presented in her presentation, that was what they, in the end, said, this is our common story. This is what we think are the things that are most important or most similar across all of our stories. So they worked together to select photographs from the stories that already existed. They recaptioned them and came up with the title for the overall story, which was, what was it again? The Bitter Truth of Success. Yeah, so there was a lot of debate and discussion about which photographs were going to be used, the title that they were going to come up with, etc. So they had a lot of discussion. They had to negotiate, and I think also in this process they were kind of doing some of the things that we as researchers do, because when you work in a team, you know, you've got opposing views and opinions, and you somehow have to make a decision at the end of that. At the end of this collective data analysis process, we asked them what they had gained from the Photovoice process, and they had sheets of paper with a sentence beginning with, when I participated in the Photovoice process, I learned. Because we were interested in finding out what did they learn from the process, is there any new knowledge, etc., that they've gained as a result of being Photovoice participants. And then we also wanted to know how they felt, because it was clear that, you know, telling your story, telling their stories in that way, having us listen to them as well, is quite an emotional exercise. So we wanted to know how they felt. And so the second sentence was when I participated in Photovoice, I felt. And this presentation draws a lot on that, because we're trying to make sense of what the value of the Photovoice project or the process was to them. And I think in looking at what they've learned and how they felt, there's a lot that we can understand about what this process has meant to them. These are just a few of the excerpts from their written reflections, and I'm going to read some of them out, but the reason why I've put some of those parts in bold, obviously, is because this is what stands out for me for most of what they've written. So Dumsani says he felt that he was part of something big and life-changing, and that being able to share his life story with someone else to help them have it better, and to able to share his life events in order to change how the education system or the education structure should work is extremely profound. Dintswala says that he felt motivated by sharing his story with different students, and that he felt welcomed because of recognizing that actually there were many other people who were going through similar experiences, so this made him feel like it was okay to kind of talk about what he was going through. And he says he always thought that maybe it's students from country university who struggle at varsity, and country university is a rural university, so when they got to interact with students from more urban spaces or more elite universities, they were surprised to realize that there were so many commonalities in their struggle. Anati says she felt belonging, which is inclusion. So this is transcribed directly as, you know, as they had written them out. And she says she also felt connected and free to express her feelings. She felt inspired, motivated, and encouraged to reach her goals. And she also felt responsible for her actions, as well as feeling appreciative, hopeful, purposeful, and grateful. Similarly, Mthunzi talks about being grateful for the opportunity, and he also says that he felt overwhelmed and he felt a connection between and around the team, but he was also intrigued by students' thinking capacity. So these are some of what they felt, you know, intrigued but welcome, there's inspired, there's motivated, these kind of things. So these are the feelings that most of them were talking about. In relation to what they learned, there was a lot about, I didn't realize that somebody else, you know, was going through similar things that I was going through, but then there was also learning about broader issues. As Busisiwe says, I learned about the learning or poor learning environments in other schools or varsities, which hinders learning. I also learned the importance of sharing your experiences with others, because you find something to relate to from their experiences too. Remisa says that participating in Photovoice helped him to think of ideas that can help other people who are coming into university for the first time. So people like him who come from his neighborhood, which is quite a remote rural area in Limpopo, and he says, so he started to think about ideas about how can I make this different for somebody else so they don't have to go through the same difficulties I went through. And finally, Bongeka says she learned that one should own his or her truth and not let it weigh him or her down. She said she felt heard and safe, which led to her being able to narrate her story without fear. She also says that she realized that she wasn't alone. As we know, the capability approach encourages the assessment of development in terms of valued freedoms. And as an evaluative framework, it is helpful for identifying and interrogating the factors that enhance or constrain freedoms. In this way, it does kind of assist us in thinking about or conceptualizing an open-ended idea of social justice. We think understanding the value of a Photovoice process through a capabilities lens required us to ask the question, what freedoms were enhanced through this process? And looking at phrases and words like feeling safe to tell my story, feeling heard, owning my truth, these are things that we think are related to narrative capability. We think that the Photovoice process in many ways gave students the opportunity to tell their stories and to be listened to. We also think that this is related to the capability for epistemic contribution. And I don't think I'm going to have time to sort of go into detail about this, but I do think that it's in the process of telling stories that social knowledge is shared or transferred or transmitted in the process of telling the story. So we think the capability to tell one story and the capability to make contributions to shared knowledge are interconnected and intertwined, and that they're also foundational to epistemic justice. And I'm just going to, kind of try and read through some of these reflections. I know this slide is very wordy, and it's a lot of what I've jotted down as I've been trying to think about how to articulate what we've done and how you might understand the value of Photovoice, but also participatory research methods or practices in general. So the power to tell one story can be rendered meaningless in the absence of narrative capability, particularly if a necessary condition for this opportunity is the freedom to be listened to. So it is the participatory and inclusive nature of the storytelling process that was enabled through Photovoice, which made student stories effective for sharing social knowledge, because we as researchers were acting as listeners in this process and came to participate in the construction of the story because of listening to them and taking the story seriously. So in the same way that parables and other genres of stories convey messages or they carry a moral, I think stories about our lives convey meaning too, and also hidden messages from which we can all learn. The capability for epistemic contribution is about having the internal ability and effective opportunity to formulate and also share beliefs about the world, including the interpretation of one's world or one's social world, without having these ideas, these thoughts, these beliefs rejected on the grounds of testimonial or hermeneutical injustice, which I think Monica mentioned, and so did Tendai. So, as I said before, I think epistemic contributions are made when we tell our stories and have them listened to, because we add to and we take away from common pools of knowledge and exchange epistemic materials that can be used to enable understanding, but also inspire us to be more empathetic and enable practical reason as well as public deliberation. So stories aren't just stories. And coming to, close to the end, I think by telling their stories, students gave to and also took away from a shared pool of knowledge about poverty and about how coming from a low-income background affects your opportunities to get into, get on with, and also reach your achievements in higher education. And they were positioned as experts on this because that's their lived experience. So we can retell these stories, we can have interviews with them and share our interpretation of what their lives are and what the significance of poverty means in a higher education context for people who come from low-income backgrounds in South Africa, but we can't tell their stories better than they can. I don't think. So to conclude, we looked for evidence of valued freedoms from this Photovoice process and came to the conclusion that narrative and epistemic contribution capabilities were enhanced for students who participated in the Photovoice project, and that both these capabilities are intertwined and foundational to more epistemic justice, not perfect, but more of it. And participatory processes, we think, other participatory processes should be evaluated according to this theoretical lens, and that we should ask questions about whether or not what we do enables an enhancement of freedoms. What else? So I think these freedoms, so that the capability for epistemic contribution and the capability for the narrative capability may have otherwise been overlooked if we had judged the strengths of our Photovoice project using the principles that I mentioned earlier on. And these principles typically encourage us to do participatory research because it enables empowerment. But I'm not sure that in the context of higher education we can talk about empowerment without talking about the freedom to learn, the freedom to know, and the freedom to tell. The freedom to do this and be recognized as a credible knower or a trusted testifier, and also the freedom to act on what we know and what we tell in order to dismantle the structural inequalities that get in the way of these freedoms that we value. I think I'll leave it there.